Hello, everyone, and welcome. My name is Suzanne Walker, and I'm the director of the Indiana Center for the Book. And I'm actually joined tonight by Kate Lentz, who is the director of the Rhode Island Center for the Book. There is Kate. I'm going to go ahead and throw a couple of links into the chat. That is the Indiana Center for the Book, and this is the Rhode Island Center for the Book. So if you guys want to see the other things that we have going on, you're welcome to check that out. And I'm very excited to also be joined tonight by our very special guest, Laird Hunt, who is the author of Zorrie. So for the comfort of everyone tonight, please keep your cameras off and your mics muted. If you have a question for Laird, feel free to type it in the chat box, and we may have time to get to some of those at the end. So I really wanted to just welcome everybody and let you know that the reason that we're here tonight is actually because of the National Book Festival. And I'm also going to put a link to the National Book Festival in the chat for everybody. That'll be my last link that I throw in there. So the National Book Festival is going to take place over Labor Day weekend on Saturday, September 3rd in Washington, D.C. at the Washington Convention Center. But some of the events will be available virtually. So if you can't make it to Washington, you can absolutely join virtually. And I actually consider this event tonight to kind of be part of the festival as well. And I'll tell you why. So each state every year is invited to choose a title for young readers. And this year, for the first time, we were also excited to be invited to choose a title to represent our states for adult readers. So Laird, I don't know if you knew that you were the first one for adult readers from Indiana for the National Book Festival. So that's exciting. So this year, Rhode Island and Indiana actually chose the same book to represent our states, and that is Zorrie by Laird Hunt. If you've read the book, then you know that the book is set in Indiana. And if you know anything about Laird, you might know that he currently lives in Rhode Island. So I'm just going to tell you a little bit more about Laird, and then we will turn it over. Laird Hunt is the author of 8 novels, including the 2021 National Book Award finalist, Zorrie. He is the winner of the Anisfield Wolf Book Award for Fiction and the Grand Prix de Littérature Américaine, the Bridge Prize, and a finalist for both the PEN/Faulkner and the Prix Féminin Étranger. His reviews and essays have been published in the New York Times, the Washington Post, the Wall Street Journal, and many other reputable publications. His fiction and translations have appeared in literary journals in the United States and abroad. A former United Nations press officer who was largely raised in rural Indiana, hooray, he now lives in Providence, Rhode Island, where he teaches in Brown University's Literary Arts program. So I'm going to turn it over to Laird. He's going to do a short reading of Zorrie, and then we will do a Q&A about the book. And tonight's program should just last about 45 minutes. So Laird, I'm so excited that you're here. Thank you for being with us.
Thank you. It's a thrill to be here. And thanks so much to the Indiana Center for the Book and the Rhode Island Center for the Book. What an honor to have Zorrie chosen for this. So yeah, I'll read a little bit. I'll read from the start of the novel, a couple pages, and then I'll jump ahead just a few more pages and read about an adventure Zorrie has when she's a young woman in the neighboring state of Illinois. Here's the start of the book, though. Zorrie Underwood had been known throughout the county as a hard worker for more than 50 years, so it troubled her when finally the hose started slipping from her hands, the paring knife from her fingers, the breath in shallow bursts from her lungs, and smack dab in the middle of the day, she had to lie down. At first, she carried out this previously unthinkable obligation on the worn leather of the daybed in the front room with her jaws set, hands pressed tight against her sides, staring up at the end of a long crack that ran the length of the ceiling, or at the flecks of blue light thrown onto the legs of the dining room table by the stained glass jade that hung in the south window. When after several minutes of this, she felt her breath slowing and the blood flowing back out through her veins, she would ease herself up, shake her head, and resume whatever activity had been interrupted. Once, though, after she had slipped in the garden and landed in a tangle of rhubarb, she lay down on the daybed and fell into a deep, dreamless sleep that wasn't interrupted until late in the evening. The cat began mewling and scratching at the side door. It took her a long time to come fully into consciousness, and as she lay there, vaguely urging her eyelids to open, aware that she was not quite awake, It seemed to her she had never felt so comfortable, so careless, so at ease. She set a feather pillow on the daybed and pulled a light wool blanket out of the upstairs closet. She began to intersperse her work in the garden and yard with regularly scheduled naps. She would lie on her side with her back to the room and look at the deep white of the wall. She would be unaware that her eyes had closed. She would sleep. Every now and again, her conscience would shake her up off the daybed and back into her weedy rows or fruit-filled trees, but mostly during the time she had allotted, and sometimes past it, she just gazed at the walls or slept. One morning, well before it was time to lie down, she looked over at the pillow and blanket and soft leather and realized, with a shudder that seemed to chill and warm her both, that she was filled with longing. So that's the very opening of the book, and it's towards the end of Zorrie's life. And I'm going to leap back now, as the book does, to when she's a young woman. She's been forced to leave home. She's at loose ends looking for work during the Depression, and it isn't easy. And she finds work that is quite remunerative. She makes some friends, but comes with a cost ultimately. She got a ride on a seed delivery truck to Morocco, but thought the prospects there looked so dim that when the driver told her she could continue on with him into Illinois as long as she helped him unload his cargo along the way, she readily agreed. When the truck broke down outside Kankakee and the driver thought the time might pass more quickly if he put his hand on her leg, Zorrie struck out at him so hard he fell back, stunned, and then she ran off through a mustard field and into a beech grove. There she cried amid the pretty trees for a time about where the deaths first of her parents and then of the aunt who had raised her had brought her. Soon, though, she became furious with herself for carrying on and for thinking of her poor dead aunt as awful, even if on balance she clearly had been. So she set her chin and marched into town, telling herself as she went that she had to live up to what a woman along the way had said about her work ethic. She asked in the drugstore who needed her to do something because she wasn't ready to starve, then asked the same question, made the same statement in the bakery and at the lunch counter. No one needed her to do anything, nor seemed inclined to rip buttons off their shirt to help her in her plight. But a kindly man wearing outsized overalls standing by the filling station gave her part of his sandwich and told her that if her eyes were good and her fingers could move fast, they were always hiring this time of year up the roadways in Ottawa. It took her 2 days to get there. The first day she walked because she didn't like the look of the drivers of the few vehicles that went by. On the second day, she had 3 rides that took her fewer than 10 miles each, and then a fourth in the early evening that drove her right up to the Radium Dial Company's doors. The office was closed, but there was a sign on the window that read, "Hardworking Girls Wanted." She was standing under it first thing the next day. She was to sit in a large, airy room in the converted high school and paint the numbers on clock faces with luminous paint. This was, she was told, important work. Not just households across the region, but the mighty armed forces of the nation were depending on it being done well. She received 20 minutes of instruction, which included several comments about the safety of the dull yellow powder she was supposed to dip her wet brush into before placing it between her lips to point the tip. The powder tasted like metal mixed with the late roots her aunt had always insisted they boil and eat, even when there were other options in the pantry cupboard. And her first few attempts at making lines and numbers on the practice faces were a mess. She soon saw how it could be done, though, and her instructor nodded, patted her once on the shoulder, and told her she could now work on the real thing. When the instructor was gone, the girls on either side of Zorrie rose as one from their places, took her by her elbows, and led her into the adjoining windowless lavatory, where, with some ceremony, they had her stand in front of the mirror over the sink before flipping the lights off. First, Zorrie saw that her lips were alive with yellow, and then that her fingertips were covered in glowing splotches. The girls behind her were glowing too. One of them had painted a heart on her cheek. The other had painted an eye on her forehead. Their hair and dresses shimmered. Their lips and teeth too were golden. They waved their arms and shook their shoulders, and as they giggled, sent off little clouds of glowing powder to drift through the dark. "I'm Marie Martin," said the one with the heart, "and I'm Janie Clemens," said the one with the eye. Zorrie's head felt like it might float off her shoulders when she came out of the bathroom behind them. and her feet felt just as light. She thought she might rise entire from the floor to twist and float against the ceiling beams. Marie and Janie shared their lunches with her. They ate at their places and had a bowl of peppermints that they encouraged Zory to help herself to. Many of the girls kept candy near them to counter the taste of paint. They laughed a great deal and made their brushes fly over the clock faces and almost never stopped talking as they worked. Zory had slept the night before in the hayloft of an abandoned barn behind a wheat field that ran green and sloping down to the banks of the Illinois. And when the day had gone to its grave, she started off for it. Janie called her back, though. She said Zory wasn't going to sleep in any barn. Zory asked how Janie knew where she was heading, and Janie laughed and said Ottawa was just a little bitty town. For her part, she planned to move to Chicago as soon as she had tucked enough away. She told Zory as they went back to her house. She would live in her own apartment and take the L each day and never come back home to Ottawa. Well, except maybe sometimes on holidays. She didn't like Christmas much, but Easter and the 4th of July were fun. Zory asked her what the L was. Janie laughed again and hooked her arm through Zory's. When they got to her house, Janie hugged and kissed and shoved her way through a horde of younger brothers and sisters, and once they were in the small room, she got to herself because she had started bringing in money. Showed Zory a picture postcard of an elevated rail line that ran 25 feet off the ground. You'll think about clock faces tonight, but stay here a while, and you'll be thinking about trains that can drop you off in the stars. I'll stop there. Thank you.
Thank you, Laird. I think your writing is beautiful and it easily transports us into other places. So thank you so much for sharing that.
Thank you.
I have a fairly long list of questions that I've prepared for the evening, but if any of you have questions for Laird, you are free to pop them into the chat box. So we're going to just start with what may or may not be an easy question. I don't know. Can you share with us what inspired you to write the story about Zory, and why was it important to you to tell this story? And I'm going to mute in between questions, but I might just stay up here so you can see my reactions.
Okay, that sounds good. You know, so this is a story that's been with me really since I started out as a writer. As a matter of fact, the first story I ever completed, apart from a few half-finished things in high school, I suppose, was a story I wrote in Japan, where I was teaching English just after college. I went to IU, Indiana University, in Bloomington, and I went to Japan to teach English, and I thought I'd try to become a writer. And I wrote this story that was called Old Woman, and it was about a figure much like my paternal grandmother who had raised me on this farm in Indiana through junior high and high school. I wrote this story and got a chance to read it to my grandmother. She said perhaps it had been inspired by her, she said knowingly, and rather pleased, I think. And then, you know, the story was there. And I wrote another book. It's actually, I have a copy of it here, called Indiana, Indiana. It was my first written second published novel. And in this novel, which is about the Summers family. If you've read Zory, you'll know something about Summers family. They live next door to Zory. There's mention of a neighbor whose name is Zory Underwood, and a particular episode in Zory's story and her connection with this neighbor, Noah Summers. And I got really interested in that character of Zory Underwood. She really makes just a tiny appearance, though she seems to exert a certain amount of force within the novel Indiana, Indiana. And so sort of for myself, I wrote her story. I wrote it, drafted it, and then for years it sat as under the title Old Woman. And that's why I brought up that earlier story, Old Woman. And she is referred to throughout the entirety of that early draft of the story as Old Woman rather than as Zory. Old woman is doing this, old woman is doing that, she's thinking this, she's thinking that. And it was only fairly recently that I realized that she had to have her name, that the story could only be told if she was called Zory throughout, and that's when the switch was made. And so it's something that's been at me, the original story, and I have that here too, of Old Woman. You won't be able to see this very well. It's actually printed on my lesson paper when I was teaching English in Japan. It's the date at the top, it's too small to see, but it's 11/28/1990. So this has been sort of gnawing at me for over 30 years, this character in the story.
I love that. Well, that gives all of the writers that are listening today hope for their stories that have been sitting in drawers for a long time. That's pretty interesting. So you're from Indiana. You now live in Rhode Island. Can you just talk a little bit? I mean, maybe you don't consider yourself as being from Indiana, because as I've talked to you today, I realize that you're from a lot of places. But can you just talk a little bit about Indiana and why was it a compelling place for you to set a novel?
Sure, yeah. And you know, when someone asks me where I'm from, I always say Indiana, even though indeed I came there later. I was a transplant, but I was a transplant, and you know, maybe unlike others, I claim it proudly.
Good. I'm very glad to hear that.
Yeah. I was a transplant, but I went there at the age of 13 in the wake of familial circumstance that I don't need to go into, but it was really the place where I started to sort of come awake to the world, I suppose, in a certain way. That landscape, which I knew, right? I've been going there all my life. I went to live with my grandmother on her farm. I've been in the family. It's now been in the family for over 150 years, that farm. So I knew the place, but I didn't know it as a 13-year-old, a teenager living in a house with my grandmother, who had her ways of being, I had my ways of being. And there was a kind of clash, a kind of friction that was strangely more powerful than other experiences. I mentioned before, I lived right before I moved to Clinton County, Indiana, I lived in London, England, and I was going to school there. And strangely, I'm not so moved to write about London or the Netherlands before that. I have, but what I keep coming back to is Indiana. And it seems to me it's because so many gears started turning for me internally in that place and in that landscape, which to my mind is not as investigated as it could be. I think there's still work to be done in that landscape that I know, particularly of central Indiana, and that I return to and that my daughter knows. I was there 3 weeks ago doing research for a new book. So it's a place I continue to go to, and that continues to feel like there are many more stories to tell. I'll tell a few of them. I hope others will tell more.
That's great. I actually have an old family farm that's still in my family in Benton County, Indiana, which is just a couple counties to the west and north of Clinton County. So I know that thing, of going to the farm every summer to see relatives. That's really great. I'm going to go ahead and pop over to the chat. This is a question from Asa. Asa says that she's reading, or they're reading Zorrie right now, and they're struck by how it manages to be a quiet novel with a broad and ambitious scope. Its scope brings to their mind Steinbeck, and particularly East of Eden. And they're wondering if Steinbeck was a writer that you have been influenced by.
Yeah, absolutely. My wife, who's a poet, Elena Sakelianos, had an amazing uncle named Poppy Sakelianos, and he was a huge lover of John Steinbeck, and we had many a long conversation about Steinbeck's work. And as a matter of fact, I mentioned living in Japan earlier. One of the novels I took with me, thinking I wanted to become a writer, was determined to be a writer, was indeed East of Eden by John Steinbeck, along with work by Gertrude Stein, William Faulkner, and others, Jorge Luis Borges Ficciones. But East of Eden was there. And in that period of those larger writers you think of, like the aforementioned Faulkner or Ernest Hemingway, Steinbeck was the one, and Eleni talks about this also, and Poppy for that matter, he really had a lot of heart, right? And there was a deep, sustained attention to the dignity of lives that were not the loudest, lives that were not the most celebrated. But he really communicated a sense of worth to people doing those quote unquote ordinary things that we all spend all our time doing, even if we're celebrated, even if we're if we step beyond the scope in some way, as so many people have, I suppose. But I've always loved Steinbeck, so I'm really glad that some echo of that is coming through in the work.
Great, thank you. Well, let's switch gears slightly and talk a little bit about Rhode Island. I wanted to give, a fair shake to Rhode Island since both of us have selected your book for the National Book Festival. So can you just talk a little bit about Rhode Island, and did living in Rhode Island have any kind of a bearing on writing Zory, or was it already kind of completed by the time that you started living there?
Yeah, well, I love living in Rhode Island. I really fell quickly under the spell of Providence, but it's amazing. We lived for 16 years in Boulder, Colorado, in sort of high plains desert. And so to be surrounded by water, as we are here in Rhode Island, is quite amazing. And I found it a really good place to work. A lot of Zory was done, but there was important revision that had to happen that I did sitting actually right here at this desk where I am now. And the follow-up book to Zory sort of connected, sort of that touches it in the way that Zory touches Indiana. Indiana, I've written a third book that explores a character, starts with an exploration of a character who appears briefly in Zory, whose name is Candy Wilson. It's a series of stories, and a number of characters like Candy get their own story. So Candy doesn't get her own novel, but she gets a story. But so I've been working on those again, largely sitting in this seat. I found it. There's a rich intellectual community in Rhode Island generally, and then I also teach at Brown University, and have met extraordinary colleagues. The students are amazing. And so, yeah, it's been a great place to write, a great place to think, and also a great place to go and swim on a hot summer's day, which is not nothing.
That sounds great. And you also get the benefit of getting to visit Indiana, and then, it never wears off because you can just always come home whenever.
I keep going back.
That's great. That actually kind of segues nicely to this other question that we have in the chat. This is from Amy, and she says, question for Laird, having read everything that you've written, former Naropa student here, I felt so many echoes of Indiana, Indiana, Never Home, and Kind One. Sometimes I feel like all your writing returns to and references itself beautifully. Is that a goal with your work, or why do you think this happens sometimes with writers?
Right. Well, hi, Amy. Thanks for coming. Amy's a terrific writer. It's great to have your question. So when I started out, I had this sense that I was going to be a writer of a couple of largely sort of different types of books. A number of them in my earlier novels deal with this, are urban in concern, international in perspective, and perhaps more experimental formally. Although that's, I'm not completely sold on them being more experimental, but just form is very important in those earlier urban novels. And then also I wrote Indiana, Indiana, and then I started writing some of these other books that deal with history, that deal with tough issues that constitute this republic, like Never Home, like in Kind One. And as I've gone along, I've realized that even those books dealing with urban concerns are taking up issues in certain ways that I had to go back and take another look at in books of sort of more rural nature. And it seems to me as I go along that there's a kind of weave that's happening, and some broader project perhaps is being elaborated that's taken different forms, different shapes, but the concerns remain. Trying to look, maybe like Steinbeck, deep into lives that have not been adequately looked at, perhaps to offer, what small imaginative muscle that I can muster in that direction. And there is, this sense that I'm returning, but also perhaps it's more like a reprise, a kind of taking it from the top. Okay, I talked about this, but I need to talk about it a little bit differently here. I need to think about it a little bit differently again here. And for a while, I thought I wouldn't recognize those urban novels the farther I went into these more rural books. And yet I think of them in some ways as being really, really closely linked to what I'm doing now. And that's something that I'll have to explore in the coming years, I think.
Great. Well, this is one more question from the chat. This is from Ava. When writing Zory, how did you balance the completely fictional aspects of the story? And then she says with the more memory-based ones, did you ever feel like you were straying or staying too true to the integrity of your grandmother as you were working on Zory or Old Woman?
Yeah, that's a great question. That's my daughter who is asking a question in the chat.
Aw.
Thank you. She's a smart cookie. So, that was a concern. And indeed, when I was writing, especially Indiana, I hadn't really figured all of this out. The way that I could sort of build on lived experience, build on things I knew, people I had encountered, the landscape that I knew quite well in that area of Clinton County. And I got into a little bit of trouble using names that in Indiana that were actual family names, even if I changed the last name. As a matter of fact, there was a wonderful older woman in the neighborhood. Her name was Angel. And Angel came to one of my family members after she had read Indiana and said, I didn't know Virgil was a drinker, Virgil being my great-grandfather. Completely different Virgil, right? Completely different story, but nonetheless set in that landscape. And so, there was a, and I didn't feel great about that, giving that idea. But over time, I felt like I was able to metabolize the difference between, my thinking about this world and the world, the world itself, as it was sort of manifesting outside of my own dispensation. Finding ways that I could be nourished by it, the work could be nourished by it without taking or taking too closely, needlessly, right? I mean, if you need to, there are all kinds of reasons why one might say writing a memoir or working closely on family history, where it makes perfect sense. But if I'm writing novels, do I need to use that name? Even if to me, it's got all this charge, it doesn't to a reader, right? Virgil didn't have a charge. Now perhaps it does over the course of Zory, etc. He's a character in Zory, he's a character in Indiana. But he never needed to be called Virgil, except it meant something to me. It allowed my imagination to move. So I don't need to do that so much anymore. But it has certainly been a part of my process.
That's interesting. I'm sure a lot of us here tonight are, I know all of us are readers, but I bet a lot of us are writers too. I actually have written a YA novel, finished it maybe a year ago, and a lot of it is really from my own high school experiences. And I picked a lot of names that were sort of related, but weren't the same names. Is that something that you found that you've done as well? Or like, do you pick names that are kind of significant to you that you get to kind of put in as a placeholder for a real person?
Yeah, naming is so interesting, and the names that I was surrounded by, sort of the strata of naming, say in Clinton County when I arrived in the early 1980s. This older generation, my grandmother's generation. Her given name, my grandmother's given name was Fairy, and her sister was Wilma, and I already mentioned Angel, and there was Dorothea, and there was Zoraida, and there was Winifred, and there was Benita Bunch. So these, to me, extraordinary names that just seemed like I had to do something with them, so that was very tempting. And then, the kids I was going to school with were called, Greg and Amy and Kim, and, a very different kind of naming that occurred in the generation that I found myself surrounded by, which hasn't been over time quite as inspiring, except that now I am, as I've mentioned a few times already, writing this follow-up to Zory. I'm not trying to do Zory over again. I don't think I could. I don't want to. But it's a novel that's set on one day in the early 1980s in Clinton County. I'm calling it a novel. I'm not a novelist, but these are actually distinct stories, to be careful. These are distinct stories, all set on one day, and each story is centered around a different character. So I already mentioned Candy Wilson, and then there are these other ones that appear in her story. That's the way the mechanism works. So someone is seen in passing, he gets his own story, or she gets her own story as it goes along. And I'm finding myself drawn to the names of my youth, the friends I had. My best friend in 10th grade, whose name was Greg Kaiser. And realizing that at a certain point for the story really to lift, going back to Eva's question earlier, I have to break, sort of do a snapping off from that name. So it helped me get started, but I changed the name. So it's no longer Greg Kaiser, it's something else.
Well, and I appreciated when I was reading Zorrie, seeing the place names and that they were real place names. And it was, having lived in Indiana my whole life, it was so nice to just be able to get the map going. And, sometimes I, would look up Illinois to see where she was and all that kind of stuff. So that was great.
Yeah.
So to talk about Illinois, radium plays an important role in the book. And I was just really interested in, I was wondering when you first learned about early uses of radium and why did you decide to include it in the story? Do you have any family stories about radium? What can you tell us?
Sure, yeah. I first read about radium in the New York Times when I was living in New York, working as a press officer all those years ago. There was an article about the quote unquote radium girls. And this one was more focused on the big operation in Orange, New Jersey. But there was another one that was very important in Ottawa, Illinois. But that, so I had it in my head, and as often happens, it can take years for something to take root. For example, I wrote another novel called Never Home about women who went to fight in the Civil War. And that started because Elena gave me a gift of a book called An Uncommon Soldier about a woman who did that back in the 90s. And it took years for that. I read it, I was interested in it. The history was amazing, but I didn't yet know what to do. And the same thing with the Radium Girls. I didn't quite know what to do with it or what my approach could be. It's important to come to these things with a kind of humility, without a kind of presumption. I didn't quite know how to find what that might be with this, really interesting history, rich, tragic history. So it took a long time, but it was always in my mind. And when I first drafted what was to become Zory, that chapter wasn't in there. That journey to Ottawa, Illinois wasn't there. And part of what was wrong with that earlier incarnation was there was a kind of static quality. There isn't anything for Zory to look back at Indiana from in that earlier incarnation. But that wasn't enough, right? She could go on a trip. She could just drive one state over and then look back. But it was thinking about the larger themes of things that glow, things that are illuminated in a kind of quiet way that may be deadly, that may be damaging in some sense, as much of Zory's experience is, right? She has a tough row to hoe, as my grandmother would have said, throughout her life. And so that material about the Radium Girls came back to me. There's a wonderful book that came out around the time that I was thinking of this called Radium Girls by Kate Moore. There's an extraordinary a documentary that you can still find on YouTube that interviews some of the women who experienced this. I can't recommend that strongly enough. So there was material out there, and I took a trip to Ottawa, Illinois. I took a Geiger counter to the cemetery, and it's true that they are still crackling under the ground. They will be for a long time to come. My Geiger counter lit up at the grave of Ella Cruz, for example, who was buried there. And I just found it very, very, very compelling. And again, without presumption, without wanting to say, let me take a little bit of this tragic history and stick it in my novel. It seemed to fit. It seemed to be what the book required. And actually, it was writing that into the book that really brought it back to life for me and made it possible to think about publishing.
That's fascinating. What a cool research trip to have your Geiger counter in the cemetery. That's really cool. That sounds like a really neat thing. So kind of because of the radium and kind of because of just lots of other things, there's a fair amount of grief in the book. Characters cope with grief in different ways. Can you talk a little bit, and this is kind of a philosophical question, but can you talk a little bit about coping with grief versus healing from grief? And I don't know how many of our attendees have finished the book, and I don't know if you can do this without giving a lot of spoilers or not. So just answer it as best as you can, I guess.
Yeah, sure. So there's no question. I mean, in the opening pages of the book, we learn that Zorrie has lost her parents to diphtheria, which is something that I had in my family background. Some ancestors that both parents went. My great grandparents were taken by diphtheria, right? So that was something that I felt like I could sort of write into the book and have an emotional connection to, and that would resonate. And Zory is sort of comes through a cauldron of loss and challenge. And there is a community that helps, right? In her case, that she takes a while for her to discover. But she is able, I think, in a lot of small ways to certainly there's the coping that goes along. For her, it's kind of like metabolizing in a way, right? The nooks and crannies of her life open up, and there's more space for her to tuck those bits and pieces of grief away, and it's sort of physically embodied. She, again, something fairly early on. I don't think it's a great spoiler. She loses her husband fairly early in the novel, and she has all these letters, and they are tucked away in a hat box, right? So there's the physical tucking away, but there's the way that you tuck it away sort of internally, and she becomes really quite good at that without being very happy about it. But she's able to find a way to carry it, right? To carry her grief, to carry her loss. She doesn't think it's any greater than anybody else's, right? It's not something she wears as a kind of badge of honor. That's not the way she's geared. That she's suffered so much. She carries it. There's a kind of grace that goes along with that. She goes to church. She's a believer. She has that that helps. She questions, she wrestles with it, as so many do, but there is that. And then, there is something that she does towards the end of the novel. She realizes that she has to take another trip. She has to make another journey to come to terms with, I don't know if it's healing, but to come to terms with that earlier loss of her husband. And it does prove healing, and it does open up other avenues for thought and feeling in her. And that was also something that changed from that earlier incarnation of the book, because in the earlier incarnation of the book, she just kind of goes on a trip to, she goes on a trip to Malaysia, actually. And she goes along with others in a tour group, which was something that a lot of the seniors in the community did in the 80s. They went off, if they had a little, they earned their retirement on the farm or whatever, and they went off and took a trip, saw the world a little bit. Zory does that, but it wasn't it didn't answer. It didn't do what the novel needed it to do, and so that was another section that changed, and she goes somewhere else, and it's more meaningful. And again, I don't think at the end of it, Zory isn't sort of dancing jubilantly around, but she's able to hold it in a way that I admire hugely, and that I've seen others who are able to hold their grief, their care, their woes. And sometimes, it's about doing, holding it yourself. And then in the case of someone like Zory, there is this community, there is this neighbor one house over. There are people who look in on her and who she looks in on. And that works and you can get through a lot, it seems to me, if you've got that.
So speaking of neighbors, and I can't think of the name of her neighbor. Who's her friend who has the wife who's living someplace else? What's his name?
Oh, Noah.
Yes. Can you talk a little bit about Noah and how he handles his grief? Because I feel like it's different than Zory.
Yeah, for sure. So Noah is he's the protagonist of Indiana, which novel opens with this line: Noah holds his hands up to the fire. Later, when it's light and the sun has begun to burn the blue edges off the new snow, Noah will take the saw, leave the shed, and set out across the field. Right. So the entire book is set. It's one night late in Noah's life, and Noah is he's, some would call him eccentric in the way that these things were spoken about in the Indiana of my youth. He would be called different. There is a visionary quality to Noah's mind. He sees things a little bit more richly, perhaps a little more deeply, more jarringly. And it's hard for him to hold on to these things. He enacts his grief perhaps more physically. He needs to move very quickly at times. He needs to sit very still for long periods of time. So he just inhabits the cares of his own life. And they have, he has a great tragedy also in his life to do with his wife, who is actually living at the Logansport State Hospital. That it's a real trauma for him, and how she came to be there. It's really traumatic. And so he's dealing with aftermath. And for most of the time, for the entire time that Zory knows him and comes to care deeply about him, he's in the aftermath of this trauma that remains very vivid to him, partly because he can't go see his wife, even though she's still alive. She's still there. He can't for different reasons that are explained in different ways. But so yeah, he's a hugely important character in the novel of Zory, and also just in my imaginary, generally speaking. He's wounded, and he doesn't carry it. He has his own dignity. He has his own way of being in the world, but it's not the same as Zory's. He's louder in his grief. He's less. He doesn't sleep so well at night. Zory generally sleeps pretty well, and if she doesn't, that's kind of a big deal for her. But Noah, he doesn't sleep much.
That's great. So we just have a couple more minutes. I'm going to take a couple questions from the chat box. This one is from Adam. Did you visit any radium factories as part of your research, or can you speak to any other methods of furthering your knowledge about the theme that you're working on before you start writing?
Yeah, it's it's important to me with all of these books that wrestle with history in different ways that I do lay important groundwork through reading, through visual material, like the documentary I mentioned, and then when possible that I put my feet on the ground. And so that trip to Ottawa, Illinois, was tremendously important. It wasn't, I just sort of segue. I remember early on getting a transmission from the writer Michael Ondaatje when I was a student long ago at Europa University, Jack Kerouac School of Disembodied Poetics. Michael Ondaatje talked about doing research for the English Patient. I think he's written about this elsewhere and been interviewed about this, but he talked about going, he had a fellowship to go to the Royal Geographic Society in England. And he didn't go there with this huge list of things that he was going to research. He kind of went there with his hands in his pocket and just sort of wandered around, occasionally pulling something off the shelf and taking a look, a kind of magpie scholarship, as it were, finding things that were intriguing to him. And that stuck with me. I don't quite do that. But when I went to Ottawa, Illinois, as I say, I went to the cemetery with the Geiger counter. And then I went downtown and I went to where the radium plant was. It is now simply the foundation that is surrounded by a chain link fence. And it's hot too. They've mitigated quite a bit. They've done a lot of work. I'm not trying to besmirch Ottawa, Illinois by any means, but it was a big problem. It was a Superfund site, if I'm not mistaken. Because when they tore down the school that became the radium plant, they originally dumped everything just at areas around town, right? So piles of red hot rubble. But I went there, and there's a statue there that a young girl spurred the community to, let's not forget this history, because the history was largely forgotten. So there's a statue of a young woman who is holding one of the fatal brushes in her hand. And she's got a wilted flower in the other. So the symbolism actually feels quite poignant when you go there. So I do try to go. So it's a combination for me of being physically in a landscape, just like returning to Indiana is hugely important. There's my memory. That's fine. I lived there for a good number of years, but I go back. I have to smell things. I have to taste things. I have to feel things.
Great, thank you. Well, this will be our last question, and this is kind of a mechanics question. what are your mechanics for writing? Is it something you do at a scheduled time every day or over a couple of weeks, or when you have some non-work time or free time or whenever the muse hits? Like, what do you do your writing? How is that structured in your life?
Sure. Well, you're getting to see where I spend a lot of my time in this office on the second floor of this house on the east side of Providence. And maybe this goes back to that earlier question about, part of falling in love with Rhode Island and Providence has been really how moved I've been to work here, to write here, to think here, to read here. And I've become a morning writer. For years. I was someone who would write at night, often, if truth be told, with a glass of wine, and there was often a cigarette, especially in the earlier days. It's been a long time since I had one of those. But at some point, I think maybe around the birth of our daughter, Eva, when early mornings became extremely indicated, we all had to be up early, something shifted for me around that time. And I indeed was getting up really, really early for a while when she was first born, 4 o'clock, that kind of thing, farm hours, really. At least that's when my grandmother said they were woken up. I wasn't there, but I believed her. Call them farm hours. So I've become a morning writer. So I love to come here into this room, cup of coffee. I've usually read the news, sort of just woken myself up a little bit, and then I come up here and I write for a few hours. And sometimes that writing is banging out these stories I've been working on. It's rough drafting, and other times it's revision. And I find that a fair amount of revision can happen here. And if it isn't working, then I'll take my laptop over to the RISD Cafe or to one of the other good cafes around town, and I find I can revise pretty well. If I haven't been able to at the desk, I can revise pretty well when I'm out in a cafe.
Wonderful. Well, thank you so much. I just really enjoyed everything about tonight. You've left us with a lot of books to read, and I would just encourage everyone to check out the other books that were chosen for the National Book Festival by the other states, because all the states got to choose a book. So if you're looking for things to read, that's another great list to refer to. Well, Laird, thank you so much. Thanks to all of our attendees who are here. Thanks to Kate from Rhode Island for bringing Laird in. And I just really appreciate this. So thanks so much, Laird. It was wonderful.
Thanks for having me. Thanks, Suzanne, and thanks to Kate, and thanks to everybody who came out. It was really, really fun.
Great. Okay, Lisa, you can stop the recording.